For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning unfolded as any other on the Normandy coastline. A delicate, damp haze clung to the English Channel, softening the world into a hushed, gray stillness. The air carried a chill, imbued with the familiar tang of brine and damp soil. It was just past 5 in the morning. Another shift, another stretch of anxious anticipation. Yet, as the faintest hint of dawn attempted to pierce the horizon, what he observed through his field glasses transformed the sea. This was no shift in the tide, nor a change in weather patterns. It was something utterly unfathomable. Where the sea met the sky, a dark line materialized, a smudge that relentlessly grew, sharpened, and multiplied. This was not a naval formation. It was a city of steel, a mobile metropolis emerging from the mist and sailing directly into history. At that precise instant, before a single Allied combatant touched the beaches below, before the world even knew the names Omaha or Utah, he understood that the Reich was destined for ruin. To grasp the profound shock of that dawn, one must immerse themselves in the prevailing mindset within Fortress Europe during the spring of 1944. From the northern reaches of Norway down to the Spanish frontier, German engineers had meticulously constructed the Atlantic Wall. Its conception was as an unbroken string of fortifications, a bulwark of concrete and steel bristling with armaments, designed to be an impregnable barrier against any invasion. Within the minds of the German High Command, and disseminated through propaganda to the troops, it stood as a testament to the Reich's formidable power. However, Oberleutnant Richter, a career soldier and a veteran of the Eastern Front, possessed a keen discernment between fabricated narratives and tangible realities. At 32 years of age, he was old enough to recall a vastly different Germany and young enough to have been forged in the crucible of war. He was a man of practicality, keen observation, and profound weariness. His command consisted of an artillery battery, its robust, steel-reinforced cannons nestled within concrete emplacements, situated a few miles inland from the very beaches the Allies would later designate Omaha. From his vantage point, a concrete bunker sunk into a commanding bluff, he enjoyed an unobstructed view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men engaged in rigorous training. They meticulously calculated firing trajectories, maintained their artillery pieces, and perpetually scanned the gray, seemingly empty expanse of water. The conversations invariably revolved around the impending invasion, Dare Tag X, the day of days. But the pressing questions remained. When would it occur, and more critically, where? German intelligence was firmly convinced that the primary assault would target Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest crossing point of the English Channel. It was the strategically logical choice. It was there that the 15th Army, comprising the bulk of Germany's western forces, stood in readiness. Normandy was relegated to the status of a secondary theater, perhaps a site for a diversionary action, but certainly not the principal objective. This represented a monumental strategic miscalculation, and it was far from accidental. It was the direct consequence of a brilliantly executed Allied deception operation known as Operation Fortitude, which left the defenders of Normandy dangerously vulnerable. Richter's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was considered superior to most others in the sector, yet it was merely a spectral echo of the elite formations that had conquered France 4 years prior. It was a composite force, blending seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front, like Richter himself, with a significantly larger contingent of very young teenage conscripts and older reservists. While brave and dedicated, they were not the shock troops of 1940. They were defenders tasked with holding a line stretched impossibly thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more akin to a patchwork quilt than an unbroken fortification. Numerous bunkers remained unfinished. Minefields contained significant gaps. The sheer vastness of the territory meant that even a formidable strongpoint could be isolated and bypassed. Richter was acutely aware of this. He had observed the clandestine routes local farmers still utilized and identified the blind spots within their fields of fire. He harbored a professional skepticism regarding their prospects against a truly determined assault. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had become a palpable entity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with bolstering the defenses, had orchestrated a whirlwind of activity. He ordered the deployment of millions of mines and thousands of menacingly jagged steel obstacles along the beaches. The soldiers colloquially referred to these as Rommel's asparagus. Rommel grasped a fundamental truth that the high command in Berlin seemed to overlook. If the Allies were not decisively repelled on the beaches within the initial 24 hours, the war in the West would be irrecoverably lost. Allied air superiority would decimate any German reinforcements attempting to reach the coast. The first day was unequivocally the only day that truly mattered. However, on June the 5th, the weather took a turn. A formidable storm descended, bringing with it high winds and turbulent seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted that an invasion would be impossible for several days. This forecast provided many senior officers with a sense of security. It was precisely why Rommel himself was not present in France. He had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday celebration. The storm, they believed, would serve as their protector. Consequently, as Richter stood his watch in the pre-dawn chill of June the 6th, the prevailing mood was one of routine. The storm had subsided, but the sea remained choppy. No one anticipated anything out of the ordinary. He was gazing eastward when he first detected it, a fleeting glimmer. Raising his powerful Zeiss binoculars, he brought them into focus. His heart, which had been beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a night watch, began to pound against his ribs. It was not a mere glimmer. It was ships, not a reconnaissance patrol, not a minor raiding party. Hundreds of them, and behind them more and more continued to appear. He swept his binoculars from left to right. Everywhere he looked, the scene was the same. The sea was no longer a gray expanse of water. It had become a solid mass of dark, menacing silhouettes. A cold dread crept up his spine, the chilling sensation of a man confronted with a mathematical equation he could not possibly solve. For a prolonged moment, Richter found himself utterly incapable of processing the reality before him. The sheer magnitude of the scene defied all logic. German intelligence had estimated that the Allies might deploy approximately 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that figure was considered a monumental undertaking. What he was witnessing was something entirely different. He attempted to count, but it was a futile endeavor. His mind, acting on pure instinct, began to categorize. He could discern the hulking profiles of battleships and cruisers. He observed swarms of smaller, swifter destroyers circling them like predatory wolves. And then there were the others, the endless, uncountable masses. Landing craft of every conceivable shape and size, packed so densely they resembled iron filings drawn irresistibly to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image remained unchanged. It only grew sharper as the sun commenced its slow ascent. The official count for the entire operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, forming an armada drawn from 8 distinct nations. It remains to this day the largest amphibious invasion force in recorded history. But to Richter, it was not a mere statistic. It was a tangible presence that seemed to warp the very horizon. It was an assertion of industrial power so immense that it rendered everything he had ever understood about warfare utterly obsolete. Germany had constructed a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by forging a bridge of steel. He fumbled for the field telephone, his hand slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4, he stated. "I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end sounded weary and dismissive. "We have reports of a few vessels, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No." Richter's voice was strained, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It is thousands. The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." A pause followed, filled with palpable disbelief. Richter could almost visualize the man on the other end, picturing him as a hysterical junior officer, spooked by mere phantoms. "Oberleutnant," the voice resumed, "the sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports indicate your observations are incorrect." Richter shouted, his voice cracking. "I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea." He slammed the phone down in sheer frustration. It was too immense, too unbelievable. He tried another line to regimental headquarters, reaching his commanding officer. "Richter, here, sir," he reported. "The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but at that moment it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was tinged with skepticism. "Richter, are you certain? The weather—" "The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major," Richter replied, "and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." This time the urgency managed to cut through the inertia. The chain of command was paralyzed by a fundamental failure of imagination. Their meticulously crafted plans, their detailed maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being rendered obsolete by the reality materializing just a few miles offshore. While Richter was observing the fleet, the High Command remained fixated on reports of paratroopers landing inland, mistakenly believing them to be the main thrust of the invasion. No one was focusing on the sea. Richter did not wait for their confirmation. He bellowed orders to his men. Stirred by the commotion, they peered out from their positions, their faces a mixture of awe and stark terror. They saw precisely what he saw. The drills were over. This was the stark reality. The heavy ordnance was brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The colossal barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, slowly elevated, pointing their muzzles towards the unbelievable fleet. Richter stood in his post, binoculars pressed firmly to his eyes. He could observe the landing craft beginning to form up. He could feel a vibration permeating the air, a low hum emanating from thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower drawing breath, and he was about to cast the first stone. The order finally arrived, just before 6 in the morning. Engage at will. For Richter, it was a release. The paralyzing disbelief had been shattered by the familiar, sharp clarity of action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun discharged. Then a second and a third. The shells screamed across the water. Richter tracked them through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride mingling with his deep-seated dread. He witnessed plumes of water erupting amidst the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were skilled. They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined rhythm, and for a fleeting instant they made their mark. Richter observed a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. A flash of orange light and a puff of black smoke erupted. While some accounts suggest the vessel may have also struck a mine, from Richter's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and subsequently sank. A cheer erupted from his men. For a few precious minutes, it felt like a genuine engagement. It felt as though their rigorous training held meaning. But the sensation was ephemeral, for after the target was struck, the fleet did not scatter. It did not falter. The gap in the formation was simply absorbed. The endless lines of vessels continued their relentless advance, an iron tide that seemed utterly unstoppable. His guns fired again and again, but for every single ship they might harass, 100 sailed past entirely unharmed. Richter felt a profound sense of futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket attempting to empty the ocean. He looked beyond the impacts of his own shells and perceived the broader panorama. The Allied battleships, vessels like the USS Texas, were now pivoting their immense 14-inch guns towards the shore. Then came the response. It began as a low rumble emanating from across the water. He saw flashes of light originating from the colossal ships, akin to a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to shred. The earth beneath him started to heave. Geysers of soil erupted across the fields. The systematic, industrialized process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had commenced. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports. They held absolute dominion over the air. German doctrine mandated armored counterattacks. However, the nearest armored formation, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and the critical need for a direct directive from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally did mobilize, it moved without any air cover, plunging into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and was decimated before it even reached the front lines. It was in that very moment, with his own cannons firing and the sky raining steel, that Richter understood this was not a battle. It was an extermination. The Allies were not attempting to outmaneuver him. They were intent on eradicating him. This singular personal realization of overwhelming force defined the entirety of the Normandy campaign. The narrative of how industrial might ultimately eclipse battlefield tactics is both complex and profoundly fascinating. If you find these deep dives into lesser-known historical perspectives compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and engaging the like button. It empowers us to continue bringing these vital human stories to light. As the naval bombardment intensified, a shift occurred within Richter's mind. The tactical portion of his brain ceased to function, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer observing ships and soldiers. He was perceiving the intricate system that lay behind them. He was seeing the factories. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and envisioned, in his mind's eye, the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale that Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion, The sheer capability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore was not a miracle. It was a direct consequence of that industrial output. He gazed at the sky, filled with an unending stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew perhaps 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies, in contrast, executed over 14,000. For every single German aircraft in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason for this disparity was not a deficiency in German courage. It was the factories. And then there were the tanks. He was well aware of the formidable reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, a source of fear for Allied crews. However, that superiority represented a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, and exceedingly difficult to produce. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the production line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler, yet brutally effective Sherman tanks. Throughout the entirety of 1944, the United States alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production, by stark contrast, never exceeded 2,000 units. The Allies were not planning to win tank engagements through superior quality. They intended to prevail by burying the panzers beneath an overwhelming mountain of steel. This was the new paradigm. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the rhetoric about willpower and ideological fortitude dissolved in the face of these staggering numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined populace could triumph over decadent democracies. Yet here was the irrefutable proof that ideology could not thwart a bomber, and willpower could not sink a battleship. Richter experienced a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were capable soldiers. They were about to perish, not because they were outfought, but because they were outmatched on a scale that defied all comprehension. They were participants in a contest that had already been definitively decided. He and his men, indeed, the entire German army in the West, were akin to a finely crafted sword confronting a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of this confrontation was never in doubt. He recalled the propaganda posters and the unwavering belief back home in ultimate victory. It was all a profound fabrication, not merely a political deception, but a mathematical impossibility. The German High Command must have been aware. They must have reviewed the production charts. Yet they had dispatched him and millions of others to wage a war they could not possibly win. It is hardly surprising that in the war's final year, the immense psychological strain and the stark confrontation with this impossible truth led to an alarming increase in suicides among officers on the front lines. They were not merely battling soldiers from America, Great Britain, and Canada. They were contending with the full, unrestrained might of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical transformed into a brutal, tangible reality. The naval bombardment reached a deafening crescendo, a constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, dust raining down from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter witnessed the first waves of landing craft reach the shore. Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the crashing surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes lining Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the initial assault troops. From his elevated vantage point, Richter could observe the terrible drama unfolding, the water turning crimson, the bodies accumulating. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a horrific toll. For a brief moment, it seemed the defense was holding firm. The Americans were pinned down. But then the industrial equation asserted its dominance once more. Allied destroyers, witnessing the carnage, undertook a suicidal yet heroic maneuver. They steamed directly towards the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, their hulls scraping against submerged sandbars. They turned their guns upon the German bunkers, providing direct fire support in a decisive action that ultimately turned the tide on Omaha. Simultaneously, novel and astonishing machines began to appear. Richter watched as amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, seemingly drove directly from the ocean onto the beach. He observed tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with enormous flails designed to detonate mines. These were Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles developed by the British to overcome precisely these types of defenses. The Germans possessed nothing comparable. The scene unfolding on the beach below transformed from a desperate struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically neutralized and destroyed by naval shells, tank rounds, and aerial bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 352nd Division would suffer approximately 1,200 casualties that day, a staggering percentage of its fighting force obliterated within a matter of hours. Richter's own battery had now become a primary target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one of the gun emplacements sent a fireball erupting into the air. Another gun was put out of action. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated. His command structure shattered. He looked up at the sky one final time. It was a moving canopy of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the initial wave of landing craft was being supplanted by a second and then a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a relentless conveyor belt of men and material that appeared, at least in that moment, to be inexhaustible. The Allies would land approximately 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beach was still raging fiercely, but the ultimate outcome had already been irrevocably decided. It was merely a matter of time and sheer tonnage. The conflict in Normandy would continue for another 2 months. The fighting within the hedgerows would be brutal and inflict heavy losses, but it would change nothing fundamental. Every German tank destroyed represented a loss that could never be replaced. Every Allied tank lost was promptly replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left a void in the defensive line that could not be filled. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that initial day, the remainder of the war was little more than an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty, by fear, or by a patriotism utterly disconnected from the harsh realities of the situation. The hope of victory, however, had vanished. It had dissipated in the dawn light of June the 6th. We often envision the demise of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing disintegration, culminating in the final battle for Berlin. But for the men stationed along the Atlantic Wall, the end arrived in a single horrifying moment of stark revelation. It was the instant they beheld a fleet that stretched to fill the horizon, a sky choked with enemy aircraft, and a force that was not merely an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. This was a new form of warfare, waged not primarily in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer peering through his binoculars at a sea that had transformed into steel, It was the morning he knew it was over.